Hi everyone, really nice to see all of you tonight. Welcome to the Roundup Dialogue session of the Global Migrant Festival. I'm Shona, I'm a PhD candidate in Oxford, but I also was a volunteer with TWC2 for about 4 years. So I've done both research and advocacy, which is the point of the panel today. Thank you all so much for tuning into this Roundup Dialogue. We've had a series of really fascinating discussions about migrant worker issues over the last couple of days around the world, all of which are available on Facebook if you want to have a look. And we've had a session at the border about the effects of state policies on migrant workers, and also a session called India Voices about migrant understandings of their own struggles, their identities, and their aspirations. But today we want to answer the burning question that emerges from all of this, which is, what can we do? Or how does what we've learned and what we know shape how we can change the world? So today I have with us a panel of 3 speakers who I will introduce shortly. But before that, I just want to introduce the format of this session. So I'll be asking the panelists to go around to answer 2 questions quickly about research and advocacy in Singapore. But this session is also all about everyone who's viewing it today and participants of the festival. So we'd love to get all of you involved. Please type your questions into the chat box on Facebook, and the Migrant Festival team will relay your questions to all of us. So let me just introduce our wonderful panelists. So firstly, we have Professor Mohan Dutta, who is the Dean's Chair Professor and the Director of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation. CARE develops academic activist community interventions that foster communicative spaces for marginalized communities. The center works with low-wage migrant workers, spanning a decade of research-based migrant worker-driven activism across 5 countries, including Singapore. The WHO recognizes the culture-centered approach that Prof. Mohan has developed as a framework for addressing health challenges in communities at the margins. Secondly, we have here Dr. Jeremy Lim, who is a medical doctor trained in surgery and public health. Dr. Lim is the Vice Chair of Health Serve and also the Director of Global Health at the Saucy Hawk School of Public Health at NUS. He has 2 decades of experience in healthcare advocacy, including end-of-life care, healthcare financing reforms, and migrant worker health. And last but not least, we have Anthea Ong, who is a former NMP that raised migrant worker issues in Parliament. Anthea is a social entrepreneur, including A Good Space, which is a cooperative of human beings interested in diverse social issues, as well as has also directed programs such as Living Lab series for migrant workers' well-being to co-create community solutions and systemic change. And Anthea also asked that she be introduced as a Mad Hatter. So without further ado, I want to start us off with the first round of questions, and we'll start with Mohan before going on to Jeremy and then to Anthea. So really the question I have for all of you to begin with is, what are your experiences with how research and advocacy can work together? So Mohan, please.
Thank you so much, Shona. Hi, I'm Mohan, and you can refer me as he, him, and I'm wearing a black shirt and I have a red lamp in the background. So, in my experience of doing culture-centered work, and particularly within the context of the work of CARE, I feel that research, advocacy, and activism are deeply intertwined with each other. And what I mean by that is that if the purpose of research is to actually look at a problem, develop a conceptual framework to understand the problem, and potentially then point us towards solutions to address the problem, that has to be intertwined with the work of actually trying to then produce the change and seeing through that the change is actually produced. Now, there are some usual challenges to conceptualizing research in this kind of way. And these challenges come from how typically we think of research as developing a conceptual framework by maintaining an objective distance. So often the opposition to this kind of framework, where you see research, advocacy, and activism as intertwined, is that you don't maintain an objective distance. Well, in the work of the culture-centered approach, we argue that the idea of objective distance in many ways is a fiction, because any approach to research comes from a vantage point, and that vantage point is often deeply political, in a sense that it is imbricated in social configurations, how society is organized, and particularly in terms of the ways in which power is organized in society. So once you accept that research is political, then the idea of bringing about change, and particularly in our work, when we work with communities that exist at the margins, the change is about bringing about transformations in structures, the ways in which society is organized, the norms, the rules, the codes that make up society. So let's connect it within the context of migrant work, for instance. Uh, in some of the early work that CARE did, and some of you would be familiar with this, and here I want to acknowledge Jeremy and the important work of HealthServe as collaborators of CARE in this work. This work had highlighted food insecurity, or a lack of access to adequate and decent quality food, as a key element in the lived experiences of low-wage migrant workers. Now, in a traditional research approach, if you take it as, our work being that of figuring that out, conceptualizing that, and publishing in academic journals, that is devoid of then committing to the actual work of making the change, which sort of would translate into what do we do as researchers to actually contribute to the challenge of food insecurity experienced by migrant workers and to addressing it. So in that sense, I say research is advocacy and activism, because the work that CARE does then translates into building what we call voice infrastructures for those at the margins. So in most instances, what we form are advisory groups of communities at the margins. So we have advisory groups of low-wage migrant workers that, first of all, make sense of their lived experiences and the challenges they experience. And then they actually co-construct or help co-design the research methodology, all the way from sampling to the interview protocol or the survey instrument, to the framework of analysis, where we work together on making sense of the emergent data. But beyond that, then, turning to the question of activism, we then brainstorm together on, after the data are gathered together, on how are we going to use the data to create entry points for change. So in a lot of CARE's work, you will see that we produce white papers and policy briefs that are often co-authored by or co-scripted by those at the margins. So you would have migrant workers actually working with us in writing up the reports. But also in a lot of our work, you will find that we run advocacy campaigns or social change campaigns. These are campaigns on social media. These can take the form of petitions. These can take the form of press releases directed at media advocacy, or press conferences that are held by migrant workers who are actually leading the conversation. Now, here comes one challenge. In academia, traditionally, when we do this work, people go, this is not academic research. What are you doing? You're not really being academics. And we have often had that question asked to us. And one can understand, where sort of the powers that be come from when they ask that question, because I think the usual understanding of research is that you would take that research and publish in journals. So the advocacy component of the work in that sense really commits to how those at the margins, in this instance, migrant workers, see spaces and avenues of expression. So clearly for them, publishing the work in academic journals can be one route, but that is not as important as getting the messages out. So with the campaign on hunger, which was about addressing the issue of food insecurity, the advisory group of migrant workers wanted messages on buses, on the outside of buses. I don't know if you remember that campaign, but we had messages that had been crafted by them and that wrapped up buses. Then they were placed on MRTs, invisible places on MRTs. Then they created an advertisement based upon a storyboard that they had co-constructed together. And that was placed on social media as well as on traditional media. So all those ways of getting the message out actually worked in that instance, because it worked to get the issue on public mindscape. It also got a number of social enterprises, organizations interested in addressing the issue of food insecurity. I can think of the BOP Hub being one example, where they really wanted to develop a food delivery program that would address the food insecurity challenges. So, what I want to demonstrate through this example, Shona, is that traditionally thinking of research as pushing the space of academic journals would not really have generated these other steps that we feel are vital. So in many ways, then, for us at CARE, it's really important to turn the idea of research on its head and really ask, who is the research serving? And that question for us is about voice infrastructure and the communities at the margins owning that infrastructure. That also then for us means often that the communities at the margins of the form of the advisory group determine when, if at all, if the research is going to be published in traditional journals. So if you will, our KPIs become a little bit different. So with the migrant worker example, we only started publishing that work in 2019-20, because the advisory group felt that they wanted to first evidence some forms of change or movement happening. And that is also one way of challenging the extractive nature of research, where we often as researchers go into communities, gather people's stories, turn them into data, and then publish them without committing to actually changing those lives and the lived experiences. So I want to just wrap up then by connecting this to the question of sustaining change. So I think, one of the challenges in our research then is, how do you sustain this kind of relationship with communities at the margins that is integral to producing that change process? And what we try to do through this whole process of creating advisory groups then is to support and nurture the capacities of communities to become researchers, to actually guide that research process themselves. And we have seen this with COVID, with the studies that CARE published. Much of that was driven by the migrant workers themselves, in terms of guiding the process, identifying the key challenges, recruiting participants, and then working through the design of the instruments. So I will just wrap up with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohan, for the detailed and really inspiring sharing. I think it's a great reminder for researchers, not just to ask for change, but to also see it through and to really work it into every stage of the research project, and to not be afraid to redefine research itself. And thank you also for showing that it can be done, which I think is very hopeful for young researchers like me. So next, we have Dr. Jeremy Lim, who will be sharing his thoughts on the same questions. Okay. Jeremy, please.
Firstly, thank you, Shona, for the invitation to really participate in this panel discussion. I think Mohan has given such an erudite overview that there's really very little left to say. Can I just make a couple of quick points? Firstly, over in HealthServe, we believe in the value of research-based advocacy. And let me do some shameless marketing. We, for the first time ever, will have a full-time research coordinator, and we're looking to hire one. So for those listening in who are interested in migrant issues and want to go live in research-based advocacy, please do come and really speak to me after this. Second thing that I want to react to Mohan's point around the typical academic divide, and here I am at least very gratified that in the School of Public Health, this year we have created a new position of a Vice Dean of Practice, right? Where I guess COVID has amply demonstrated that public health comes alive in the application and not in the journal publications. And yes, you may have a very high journal impact factor, your H index may be stratospheric, but what have you done, right? And here I am very sanguine that the United States, and happy Thanksgiving to everyone who has affection for the US. The US is probably the most published country in the world when it comes to pandemic preparedness, how to deal with outbreaks. And in fact, it was ranked number one in the Global Health Security Index last year. But as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And let's just say that if I had to choose one side, I would go on the side of practice any day. And perhaps let me build upon what Mohan shared by speaking about the interactions with the government, because here in Singapore, we have a very unique situation where the government is extremely powerful and the power balance is very, very clearly skewed. And here I would really divide advocacy into two parts. One, there's the incremental sort of change, and if you were pushing to raise, say, social assistance support from X to X plus Y, it's actually not as challenging because the government is aligned with you, is more pragmatic on how do you move from X to X plus Y. It's far more challenging when you're trying to shift mental models, when you're trying to say that, yes, migrant workers have as much right as any other Singapore resident to have good food, to travel in safety, and there are clearly cost implications. That's when we get into the mental model and we strike at the core of the value of human life. That's when the advocacy becomes much more challenging. And here, two things that I would raise. One is that the sincerity of the organization of the individuals as perceived by the government is very important. I do recall that many ministers have shared with me very candidly that they consider it extremely distasteful to be writing for foreign journals and newspapers to criticize Singapore. And I guess it is a very Asian thing to view it as washing your dirty linen in public. How can a Singaporean write for a foreign publication on how bad Singapore is? So there are some OB markers that you have to decide, do you want to deliberately cross over these lines? And the second point that I will make in interacting with the government, and we as self-serve are widely perceived as the kind of good guys, and that's totally deliberate. We have our own starting point is in healthcare services, right? And if you recall, the old name for the social service agencies was VWOs, voluntary welfare organizations, and the not so subtle interpretation of the government is that please focus on pastoral and welfare and none of this advocacy sort of stuff. That's for the politicians to do. So the government has never actually welcomed advocacy, right? And the reason why we as self-serve can kind of coexist very nicely and work closely with the government is because there is an ecosystem. And we can engage with the government, sit on Ministry of Manpower task forces and be effective, because when they look at health serve, they say, we don't like what you said, but it could be worse. There are other groups, and it's in this ecosystem that we draw strength from each other and work very closely behind the scenes to move the agenda forward. So it really takes a village. And back to you, Shona.
Thank you so much for the sharing, Jeremy. And I think a very powerful reminder that research doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists, it can be used to change relationships between state and society and so on, right? So there's need to be strategic about research rather than producing knowledge for knowledge's sake. Okay, next we have Anthea, who I'm very excited to hear from. So Anthea, please.
Thank you, Shona. And thanks, Mohan and Jeremy. I was actually really listening. I felt like I was a student in your classes. That was actually really inspiring and so enriching. So to your question, Shona, about what are my experiences with how research and advocacy can work together, I would say that it's been complicated. I think personally that they are not joined at the hips, neither can they live sort of optimally without each other. Especially I think in the migrant worker space. I do feel that not all research is conducted with advocacy in mind necessarily. And I think, Mohan alluded to that. I really like how you want to sort of look at research from an activism sort of a vantage point, but nor are all advocacy efforts only made when there is research done, right? And so to Jeremy's point, Health Serve is very focused on sort of research-based advocacy, and I completely respect that. But I do think that not all advocacy efforts are only made when research has been done. But it's clear, and I think Jeremy just completely validated that evidence-based advocacy clearly delivers a much bigger punch than one without research, right? So I'm coming from a very different premise, and certainly in terms of using Jeremy's word in practice, I'm as much an accidental parliamentarian as I am an accidental advocate. My 30 years in corporate leadership meant that it was innate for me, to find solutions for problems, including community and social problems. But I've always tried to solve them as an entrepreneur, right? As an innovator, as a change maker. And that's very innate in me. But before long, I realized, no matter how creative the solutions may be, I always seem to hit a wall because there will always be some structural issues that no amount of work on the ground can address. And I obviously, the first one that I hit the wall was mental health, and that started about 14 years ago. And migrant workers and a whole host of that came about after. So as someone kind of lurking in the murky waters of not being an academic, nor a policymaker, nor sort of a full-time advocate or activist, for me, in terms of my relationship with research, has always been secondary research, right? That I rely on, particularly when I was in Parliament for the 2 years. So there was a lot of creativity and resourcefulness on my part and my volunteers' part. Whether in writing a speech, asking questions, commentary, or engaging directly with the authorities, to advocate for change, right? So for me, it's, Jeremy kind of said that, the government is not so excited about anyone else kind of delving into advocacy except politicians. So I was, an accidental politician. So I jumped straight into it, right? So we just go all out in terms of advocacy. But it was challenging. That's what I meant by complicated, right? Because information and data, as we all know, in the advocacy field is not readily available. And so, so much of it therefore meant that I had to, go down to the streets, if you will. In fact, I used to joke with my fellow NNP, Walter Tessera, that I would never be able to write a speech like he does at lightning speed because, he has access to all the data and research. And I have to do so much of street research, right? Ground research, which means that I have to engage with the communities that I'm actually, trying to bring their voices to Parliament and even also directly with the authorities for. So this would help, therefore, then reinforce and validate the secondary research that I can get my hands on, right, through the street research. But it's also the other way around, right? I could actually have communities who come forward to me with their challenges, with the issues that they would like their voices to be brought to Parliament or to the authorities, policymakers, and then I go then find research to support that, right? To back that up. So for me, there's always this complicated dance that I have between research and advocacy in my role as a parliamentarian, but also as a change maker. So I had to be very creative as well in Parliament. In particularly where migrant workers are concerned, Shona, I had to be very creative in how to leverage a bill that's tabled, right, for debate to advocate for the migrant community. Because you can be sure that there aren't that many bills that are actually tabled that would address the migrant communities. I mean, in my 2 years, there was only one bill that was directly able to sort of target the migrant workers, and that was the Worker Injury Compensation Amendment Bill. So for example, what do I mean by being creative, right? Like I had to use the Payment Services Bill, right? Which was really a bill that was tabled. It was a new act that was really looking at the whole sort of fintech sector and, our sort of electronic payment system and all of that. And so what I did was then having to, I saw an opportunity, and at that point, we were really still trying to push for electronic salary payment. And so then it was to go find research about the amount of remittances made by our migrant brothers and sisters, and then linking it to how is not, very smart nation at all thing to do if they are not actually within the electronic financial system. And if they should be in the electronic financial system, then their salary payment should be electronically paid, right? So it's kind of that sort of roundabout way of advocating, but using research to back that up. Well, I think up to that point, I guess I had argued enough on moral grounds. Then I decided to put my former banker hat on and my capitalist hat on, right? The other example was the GST voucher amendment bill. It was also an opportunity to highlight the dismal financial conditions, right, of our migrant friends, and then pushing for more systemic support. All of this doesn't mean that I got really anywhere per se, but I think that for me, a little bit like what Jeremy said about health serve, that the premise for health services is health services. For me, is actually to bring the voices of migrant workers into Parliament, and through that, also getting the media to report on it. So if there was change that comes from it as a bonus, but if it's not, that wasn't actually what I was actually banking on. So the other part about research and advocacy, I think as a parliamentarian, there was clearly the opportunity for me to push, and use the lever or the platform of parliamentary questions to seek the data and the information that we need, for the system. And very often I'll be working with a lot of the NGOs and even sometimes academic institutions to pose the questions for information and data that is not available as secondary sources, right? So that helps us to, I think, as a system, as a community, and for all the advocates to, and even academics, to be able to access that information that can only come from the government. So that's my take on your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthea. I mean, that was a really fascinating insight just into the nitty-gritty inner workings of what goes on in Parliament that I certainly have not heard before. Thank you also so much for, I think there were so many things in that, for reminding us of, in a way, this knowledge inequality. We know a lot more about certain issues than others, and that really shapes, what we can say, whose voices are included, and also about what is success? Is it the bill being passed, or is it getting more media attention to a certain issue? And I think the public is maybe a piece we haven't really spoken about yet. But okay, I want to move on to a second question. I think it's so wonderful that we have a really diverse panel, people from NGOs, universities, parliament, and so on, and corporate sector, all together. And from that, I suppose I have two questions that are related. The first is, what advice would you have for researchers who want to do migrant worker advocacy? And the second would be, conversely, what advice do you have for NGOs and advocates who want to engage with researchers? Finally, I just also want to remind everyone watching to please post your questions on Facebook, and we'll get to them after this round. So perhaps I could just start with Mohan again, and then we'll do the same kind of order.
Thank you so much. And I also just want to say thank you, Anthea, for that beautiful explication of the creativity. What came across to me in your sharing is the creativity in the change process and how you can insert voices within parliamentary processes. Because I'm interested in the question of voice, Shona, I will come back to that and outline a few key elements in terms of conversation for researchers interested in migrant worker advocacy. The first thing I will say is that, the process of research is one of imagination. And I would invite you to imagine, and in that sense, perhaps, challenge the box that has been given to you and try to push it. So if you have been told that it's not Asian to publicly share your research that shames power structures, I would say challenge it. That is the work of research, to challenge, to imagine new registers, and to create new language for conversations. When a number of us decide that we are not going to be constrained in the boxes that are given to us, we start building new registers. So that's the first thing. Second thing I will say is the concept of solidarity. I find solidarity to be really important. As a researcher, I'm mindful of how quickly, as I said in the earlier part, how quickly research can become extractive. And how often, when I work with low-wage migrant workers, be it within the context of the US or Singapore or India or here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I often hear, from the workers that say that, what will happen after you gather all these stories from us? Is there really change going to happen? And there is often quite a bit of pessimism. There is often also a sense of another layer of exploitation, sort of where our research process itself becomes an additional burden that we add on the workers without really contributing to their sense of efficacy and ability to make change. So I think that kind of solidarity with workers is really important, and that commits us to a long-term relationship. So that, when you think about doing a survey, sending out a survey, or doing an interview, don't think of the worker as a participant in your research and that interaction being a one-time thing. Care enough to want to go back, care enough to want to build a relationship. I just posted before coming to this talk that I'm waking up at 1 a.m. and getting ready. And this has been my pandemic mode for the last several months, because oftentimes, I will have a worker brother text me saying that they want me to translate something, or they want me to come online to help translate an interview that they're going to do. And I have to be there with my body in solidarity with them. So that actually changes also the nature of the relationship, where there are certain expectations that are placed on me as a researcher to be something else in order to lend my humanity and my body. So, often we think of research, something that turns us into experts. And that oftentimes actually removes us from the relationships and from relating and connecting to the people that we work with. And I think this idea of solidarity is an invitation to turn toward relating and connecting. I will also talk about solidarity in terms of the importance of solidarity with activists and advocates. And I think Jeremy did a beautiful job of talking about the work of HealthServe, and as a service delivery organization, the ways in which HealthServe negotiates. And Anthea touched upon that too. And then there are activists that I find incredibly important in that ecosystem that Jeremy was referring to, activists like Jolovan, activists like Kokila. And I think it is absolutely important for us to lend our solidarity to them when they get attacked for speaking up and challenging the structures. And I can recall, when Kokila had brought up the whole food issue with migrant workers with COVID, and that got picked up, got discussed in Parliament, and there were references made as if someone is anti-national or unpatriotic because they brought up the food issue. And I think it is important for us as researchers to stand in solidarity at those points rather than keeping shut. And I'm sorry, talking about Asian values as some way for keeping mum doesn't work. It is just unethical in that sense in my books. So, something that I have tried to do in my work is sort of, sometimes, I'm asked, as a researcher, why do you have to express solidarity with Jolovan? Or why do you have to express solidarity with Koki? And I think that is absolutely important if we are talking about creating transformative spaces and registers, so that actually those that are pushing the structures can have the spaces for their voices to be heard. Which brings me to my third point, and which is that if research is about transformation and if advocacy is about transformation, we also have to think about how we build new political registers. As a communication scientist, for instance, I look at the idea of OB markers as a social construction that is embedded within sites of power. So in that sense, the materiality of OB marker is created within powerful structures. So we have to question those OB markers. As researchers, I think we have to question those OB markers. And we have to do so as collective entities. And what do I mean by that? To the extent that researchers as advocates are not collectivized, what happens is there is one person or two people that do these, and it's easy for them to then become targeted or become black marked and sort of be outcast of the system. But I think where more people do this and where they make this a habit of standing beside each other as they do this, that will create and build new political registers. So finally, Shona, I will just say in wrapping this up, that research is a lot about advocacy. Research is connected to advocacy, and it can bring about transformations. Believe in that. This is what I will say to new researchers. Don't let someone come in and tell you that, and often, you will hear horror stories. Like, how many times have I been told, if you want to research marginalization in Singapore, don't study Singapore, study other parts of the world. Just don't study Singapore, you'll be safe. And you will be told those stories, and sometimes from well-meaning people. But I think it's also important to question and interrogate and challenge those stories, and then think about how actually the kinds of stories we contribute to building connect to the voices of those at the margins. I want to come back by summarizing what one of our advisory group members often says, and this touches upon something that Jeremy earlier articulated. I'm not going to share his name just to protect his identity, but he says that as a migrant worker, when I'm struggling with food, it's not about, I'm not begging here for food. It's not about people's kindness that I depend upon. It is my fundamental right as a worker to get access to decent food. And when they say that, and this is the part, right? Sometimes we as researchers think that, oh, we have to come, and sometimes I've seen this in civil society too, this attitude that we have to come and educate the workers. When you actually listen, you might be amazed at what the low-wage migrant workers will teach you about processes of change. So this idea of articulating my rights as a worker and laborer is a beautiful register that can teach us, in fact, how we go about doing research. So I think that kindness is important. Often in our registers for doing research, we appeal to people's kindness and altruism and being nice. That's good. But that will not take us all the way to structural transformation and changing structures. For that, we need an understanding of rights, and we need a foregrounding of the question of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mohan. I just want to read a comment that we got from one of the viewers, which actually resonates a lot with how I felt when I was listening to you. And the commenter says, thank you so much for reminding us of why we should do research in the first place, not to become experts, but to make human connections and to create space for transformation. And likewise, when I was listening, I actually wrote down, this is a really a wonderful appeal to us as humans, to our imaginative capacities, to think about new registers, new ways of communicating, new ways of collaborating, and as people who are embedded in communities and who can form solidaristic bonds with other people, and who should not be afraid to kind of corral these relationships for social change. So thank you very much for that. Next, we have Dr. Jeremy Lim, please.
Yeah. I think as we think of the ecosystem of really research and really advocacy, we do appreciate that it's very heterogeneous. I mean, I am struck that when I spoke at the Workers' Party COVID forum earlier this year, there were a lot of concerns expressed by my well-meaning friends that I would get into trouble. And in fact, one of the ministers asked me why I was doing this. I said, really, Minister, you have less to worry on healthcare from the Workers' Party than you have from every other political party, because the Workers' Party positions, at least on healthcare, are far closer to the PAP than, say, the SDP or anything like that. So even within the community of advocates and activists, there is this continuum, and it's the heterogeneity that gives the vibrancy, right? And so we don't need to agree with each other on everything, but let's agree that what we want is to make the world a better place and to make the lives and the livelihoods of the migrant workers better over time, right? And so the health serve model of research as well as advocacy is, I would be upfront, it's not for everyone. We are effective in our own way because, and I'll say it very candidly, because my dear friends in TWC2 and in home know that because they exist, because they are much more assertive and much more aggressive in the media, that ironically creates space for us as health serve to then engage with the government to say, okay, guys, let's start thinking about solutioning. You really don't want this to drag on for weeks and weeks. It's just making everyone look bad, and we're not getting any closer to effective solutions. And I guess I am reminded of really Lee Kuan Yew's frequent advice to civil servants that Singapore is different because we see the world as it is and not as we want it to be. And in the Singapore setting, we don't really have politicians. We have technocrats who pretend to be politicians. So their worldview is really one driven by numbers, by show me the data, show me the evidence, and that's why in the Singapore setting, advocacy driven by research becomes very difficult because there ain't no data. And if the government doesn't want this to be an issue, it basically starves the issue of data, which is the oxygen that every fire needs to ignite. So I guess we just accept the world as what it is, and we push for change within the box, right, to make the box bigger. Others would take a different worldview and try to break the box down from the outside. And I do actually think the ecosystem needs both. But on your specific comment about the advice for researchers as well as for advocates, I would say, for heaven's sakes, work together, because we need each other, right? The researchers need the advocates need the researchers, and by working together, we are much better. Just a small practical point. Uh, I I I tend to write stuff across a fairly wide spectrum. When I'm very critical of the government, I tend to write the commentary, the opinion piece alone, because it would be a super sabo, as we say in Singlish, to the poor young researcher who is just starting, hasn't won a first grant, and cannot afford to be pigeonholed in the wrong box. And in a sense, rightly or wrongly, the prevailing mindset is that you have to earn the right to criticize, to take a really position. And I would say that for a young activist, for a young researcher, you gotta be practical and figure out how hard you can push early on. By the time you're my age, you can do whatever damn thing you want, because you've been there, done that. I've had the privilege of being criticized publicly, not by one ministry, but by two ministries at the same time. So it's actually okay. But if I were 25 years younger, I would say it would be much more challenging. So back to you, Shona.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. I think that was also a great reminder that the research landscape is both heterogeneous and something that's changing. I think you alluded to that earlier as well when you mentioned the Vice Dean for Practice at NUS, right? And not just that research is changing, but the state is changing as well. And the state isn't heterogeneous. Now we have, I guess, a more diverse parliament, even in a limited way, than we've had for many years. So it's important to kind of take stock of all these.
Shona, I would disagree. I don't think the state has become more tolerant. I would say that the state has become much more obviously heterogeneous, and there are distinct power bases with very different mental models, very different ideologies within government.
Yeah.
And so, Minister A may be very sympathetic. Minister B will ask, can we arrest these guys? The landscape is dynamic and it's complex.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also fascinating. I'm glad we have Anthea next, because I think as someone who's not part of the mechanism, we always see it as kind of this black box or something that's really hard to understand, and we end up maybe having certain stereotypes about it. So, Anthea, I think I just put you in a difficult spot. But now it's your turn. Thank you.
Thanks, Shona. I'm not sure I'm going to be very typical as a parliamentarian. I think it's now known that I've crossed several OB markers in the questions that I have raised and the speeches that I've also spoken on in Parliament. But I think to Mohan's point, I definitely have clearly also danced with pushing that, those frontiers, right, in Parliament. And it wasn't done because I was doing it just for the fun of it. I actually come from a place of, truly wanting to see the change and feeling that there is this privilege that I have with the platform of an NMP, which is nonpartisan, and the responsibility of having, many of these migrant brothers and sisters, and obviously the NGOs entrusting, right, in me, their voices, their aspirations, and their hopes. And so then with all of that, not that, it was always easy, but I felt that was a absolutely excellent opportunity for us to raise some of what is typically termed the OB markers, right? Particularly in the sort of migrant worker issue. I'm really taken by your point on solidarity, Mohan, and that's been something that, it's been something that I've really been as intentional as I can. And it's not just in terms of, the work that I do as an NMP, but also, as the chairperson and founder of A Good Space, in that when we talk about wanting to sort of solve problems in the communities and in society, that very often we come in with the lenses that we know better, even with the most noble, right, and well-meaning of intentions. But it's actually really important to not come to them to to give them what we think is right for them, but to actually just hold space, work with them, and let them be the one to actually teach us what is the best way to present their challenges, their issues, in the case of my parliamentary speeches, but also in terms of the solutions that we are trying to create right on the ground. But going one step further is also to support them where we can with the resources, so that they then be the ones to be change makers themselves, right? They solve the very issues and problems in their communities. And that's whether it's migrant workers or rental flat communities, single mothers, right? That's something that I feel really strongly about, and you articulated it really well by using the word solidarity. So it's really standing with them and not, coming in to tell them what to do. What advice would I have for researchers? I wouldn't call them advice, but more maybe opportunities and possibilities. Do we have? Shona, you talked earlier about, the point about the public, right? And that's been something that I'm very, very focused on in the work as an NMP and an advocate. Because I feel that as much as we can actually, look at research trying to sort of recommend policy changes to the authorities, to the policymakers, hands are going to be tied if the electorate or if majority of Singaporeans or the general public are actually not on board, right? And that I've been told many, many, many times over and over again. Whether it is in Parliament openly or actually when I engage with them directly on different issues, right? Not just the migrant worker issues. So I would actually love to invite researchers to reframe research, not just to look at how we can actually use research to inform the changes that need to be made to policymakers, but also to kind of change mental models and mindsets of the public, of Singaporeans. And I don't know how to do that because I'm not an expert, but I'm sure between Mohan and Jeremy, they can kind of give you some ideas on how do you then reframe the work you do as researchers to change the minds of Singaporeans. Because I can tell you that, interestingly, most of the issues I raised, I get a lot of support from Singaporeans, but every time I actually raised an issue, a question, or I speak up, for the migrant workers, that's when I see on my public Facebook pages and even news sites that Singaporeans then start to have issues with, what I said. So I think that it's definitely a need to bring the rest of Singaporeans along as much as we want to change policies at the policymakers level. So that's very much what I would actually ask and invite researchers to do. I think on that note is also why at A Good Space, we have been very sort of intentional and conscious of how we actually want to look into, we pick migrant workers' well-being as an issue, and we call it the Living Labs, right? This is a Living Lab series. The whole Living Lab series is to look at a sectoral issue or cause or challenge. The idea here is to engage all stakeholders, but we don't want to just do it the usual way. We also want to sort of use technology and AI and work with, folks like OP to then start to gather information, emotions and sentiments from as wide, a universe as we can, right? So then we reach out really to as far as we can within the Singapore population. And so with this kind of tools, we're hoping we can then look at common ground and where are the tension points and understanding from each stakeholder. But more importantly is then creating opportunity statements from this information that's gathered after the synthesis, and then putting it out to the change makers to co-create community solutions. And these change makers would also include our very own migrant brothers and sisters themselves, right? And that's very intentional, and that's very much part, and a very much front and center focus of how we're going to come up with a solution. So those are the opportunities. I'm not sure how you weave it into the research part of it, and vice versa. Your second question, not advice, but COVID-19 certainly for me, when I was at the heart of this sort of a humanitarian effort. To support our migrant workers in the dorms at the onset of the disease spread in the dorms. I saw for the first time in a long time how the different groups within the migrant communities came together, right? In the most kind of organic, but there's also some sort of that systemic flow and dance that we were having with each other. So I hope that we don't go back to our silos, that we continue to at least, even if we are doing our own thing in a way that that actually aligns with our philosophy, I think we should continue to have that sort of the larger conversation with each other. And therefore, from a research perspective, I would hope that when NGOs and advocates, when you want to engage with researchers, it'd be awesome if you have some sort of a common framework so that someone like me, who's clearly not, statistics trained or not an academic, I don't have to be looking at different research on the same thing that's done by different groups and then try to make sense of it, right? And I think there exists an opportunity there, and it allows us to also come together as a larger ecosystem. Thank you, Shona.
Thank you so much, Anthea, and for all of that. I think, starting out with kind of solidarity and the idea of having to listen to people, and then I think what we keep coming back to throughout, and that was also coming through with what you said, was this need to reframe research as a method of communication, with Singaporeans who themselves have their own relationships with migrant workers, who have a certain power to influence policy, and then to migrant workers themselves who are affected by research, but who can be change makers in their own right. So thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to some audience questions. And again, I would encourage anyone in the audience to please, now is your chance. Please ask questions to our wonderful panel here today. So the first question we have is directed to Jeremy specifically. And our commenter just wants to know, how does HealthServe leverage research in its everyday operations?
Oh, okay. I will keep the answer very, very brief. It's really to help us in things like service planning, to know where the workers live, what are their age demographics, and what sort of diseases they have. This then allows us to plan where to site clinics, what sort of doctors, should we start specialist clinics, and so it's just very practical operational research. And we work very closely with the hospitals. Like during this COVID crisis, the patients who need follow-up, it's too expensive to go to the polyclinics because they are treated as really non-residents. And so we become the really cheapest place. And so we work closely with all parties, but the operational research is really guided. It's actually relatively short-term, and it's simply guided by how do we make things better tomorrow, right? So that's really one part of the research. And on the health service side, we also look at some of the more far-ranging issues around rights. And I know that in Singapore, people are a bit awkward about talking about rights, but it's very important to talk about rights, right? And so things like mental health support and really so on. These are the pieces that we were very, very fortunate that we have been doing research and supporting research in mental health for migrant workers for the last couple of years. And COVID was the opportunity to bring everything into the spotlight. And I guess thankfully there's been such an outpouring of popular support among civil society, amongst the public, that and even amongst government. So the priority for us next year in terms of really research would be around mental health. And now that there is political will, there is a mandate, there are some modest resources, how can we do the best with what we have? And back to you, Shona.
Thank you so much for giving us some insight into how I think research is not just produced by universities, but can also actively support on the ground efforts. So we have another question. Someone is asking about the objective of research on migrant issues and economic importance, and how researchers can take these studies to the masses. And I think how I would rephrase that, Pats, is to ask, what can researchers do to make their studies popular among masses, as people often see migration as harmful, despite research to the contrary, right? And I think this is a fundamental paradox that a lot of Singaporeans deal with when talking to others, is that you might read research and be very, very supportive of migrant rights, but you might talk to others who really do see migrant workers as a threat. So how do you kind of tread between these different perceptions? Yeah. Would anyone like to take this up? If I might call on Mohan first, and then someone else.
The one thing I want to say is that, and Anthea kind of touched upon this, is the public opinion and public sentiment on migration is so important to consider. And I think, one of the things to think through, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit, because on one hand, we work with poverty and low-income families, and on the other hand, we work with low-wage migrant workers. And it's really interesting that these are often treated as silos. Now imagine what would the registers look like if you were to connect these two things together, because they are actually connected, and it's an issue of working class, worker rights and minimum wage, and what are fundamental living and working conditions for the worker, right? So that requires some kind of connecting to do, where one has to find spaces for dialogue and conversation between the working classes, the heartlanders who are actually experiencing economic difficulties, for instance, and migrant workers. So what happens, for instance, if you build communicative spaces for conversation and dialogue, bringing working class families in conversations with migrant workers and identifying the issues. And you would in fact see that a lot of the issues are quite similar. These are issues of how do I get by? How do I actually just have enough food? How do I have decent living conditions? How can I make sure I'm getting paid? And then this process also then raises some really fascinating questions, such as, I look at the whole smart city rhetoric, and I think that, there's no one that raises critical questions about all this skills future and skills upgrades. So apparently we are going to have low-income families that are going to learn how to code, and somehow that is going to prepare them for an AI future. And there is no critical register there. And I think we need to have that kind of a critical register that connects across spaces. So connecting migrant workers with low-income families, with the working classes, and building spaces for solidarity that way. That would be my thinking, Shona.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan. I think you're absolutely right that, so many of the struggles that low-income families face and migrant workers face are similar. And migrant workers themselves have families that they are struggling to support. And yet we rarely see these people in the same kind of paradigm. Right? And this is one of these fundamental problems. I think, Jeremy, would you like to chime in about public support?
Yes, and I think in a very crowded media space, it's extremely challenging for any issue to have sustainable traction, right? So rightly or wrongly, researchers just have to be opportunistic, do be friendly to journalists so that they will be friendly to you next time, right? Because that's just how the world works. You help people you like, and you like people you help. So, and in a sense, when we look at really mobilizing public support, it's really on two fronts. One is towards highlighting that this is an issue that is worthy of government action. And after that, once you've cross that certain critical threshold, then you move into solutioning. And if I recall, part of the reason why I do a lot of work outside Singapore is because in the years 2012, 2013, I had quit my job to be a social activist, and lobbying is a terrible word here in Singapore, to basically advocate for what is today called MediShield Life and the Pioneer Generation package. And I was really struck that after 6-7 months of writing almost a weekly column for the newspaper, giving a lot of public talks, I was then invited to a very nice lunch by one of our very senior politicians to say, the time for advocacy is over. The government is persuaded. Why don't you start focusing your energy on solutions? And unfortunately, in the world of the Singapore government, solutions tend to be a lot drier and very technical, actuarial models. And these are the ones that you don't need to mobilize public support. So I do see public support not as a universally target to be aimed for, but it's very situational, right? And clearly on the migrant worker front, we're actually in a good place. If you look at us 12 months ago, there's been so much support. And importantly, at least within the healthcare community, many doctors have not been exposed to migrant workers before, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, virtually every doctor has come into contact and seen that, wow, these guys are human beings just like us. They have very, very similar aspirations, and now that COVID-19 is hopefully stabilizing a little, the doctors are some of our most ardent supporters in pushing for better healthcare at the system level for the worker community. So that's been one of the silver linings really behind COVID. And back to you, Shona. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Thank you for reminding us of, I guess, how heterogeneous public support can be as well, and how certain policies require different outcomes. And I think I'm also just very struck by how we went an hour and we didn't talk very much about COVID, which is quite impressive these days. So, but we can definitely talk about that after this. But thank you. I'm going to move on to our next question. Again, one of our commenters asked, I understand how the dynamic of good guy versus bad guy might be seen as effective in the short run for certain groups, but might it create an ecosystem that is harmful towards structural change in the long run? I suspect this is directed kind of at Jeremy and kind of this idea of where to go in the States. But of course, why don't we start with you and then the rest of the panelists can chime in.
And I suspect Mohan and I share somewhat different views on this. So thank you for letting me go first. We have really struggled with this good cop, bad cop, and really it is not intentional. It really reflects that the big NGOs in the migrant workers space, MWC, TWC2, Home, and really HealthServe, we are actually different. It is not that any of us are deliberately playing to roles or to personas that are not us. But we in HealthServe actually genuinely believe that the best way to engage the government on health-related issues is through a constructive dialogue, through collecting data and essentially saying, guys, we can be useful here or we cannot be useful here. And often we tend to, and here, Mohan, please do feel free to criticize me, but I'm going to use this Asian concept again, but we have found it a heck of a lot more useful to talk to the government behind the scenes and say, guys, what the hell are you doing? It's such a bloody disaster. These are all the things that are happening, rather than to write an angry letter in the forum or to write something for the Wall Street Journal. That in our experience has not been useful because it essentially closes minds. And when minds and hearts are closed, it's so much more difficult to come to a solution that everyone can participate in. We have spoken a lot about how everyone needs to contribute. You've got to hear the voice of the workers, the voice of the advocates and the researchers, but the government has a voice too, right? And I guess we have not found it useful to be blatantly antagonistic. Back to you, Shona. And Mohan, please.
So I think before Mohan, I think Anthea wants to say something. So over to you.
I'm going to come in to just, just kind of ease the heat a little bit. So I just want to, say a few words. I think the question, it's very real. There is this narrative of good activists and bad activists. And I think if you have been in the advocacy and, activism space in Singapore, I think we all don't have this kind of skirt around it. That definitely exists, right? But I also want to just raise this because I've been in actually a very interesting position. I've actually kind of feel like I've been, particularly for the migrant worker issue, I've been playing a little bit of that facilitator role between the government and some of the migrant worker groups, and certainly in terms of certain specific migrant worker issues, particularly with mental health. And I guess part of it comes from the fact that I've been obviously very much vested and involved in the larger mental health sector. And what I've observed, particularly this year, is that both sides are kind of standing on what used to be in terms of the relationship, right? In other words, the government may still hold on to certain perceptions, certain views of certain groups and how they work. And I'm not saying that, that's right or wrong, but same goes with some of the NGOs with the government. The truth of the matter is that actually both have moved, right? Well, actually the whole world has moved, but, both sides still sort of stay with a sort of a very entrenched belief or narrative of each other. And so I remember very, very distinctively sharing with a minister whom I spoke with and in the light of this issues, to actually say that, hey, maybe, and I didn't say maybe, I said, well, actually the views are a bit changed. And same with some of the, what you would call more sort of assertive, more activist groups, they are also seeing that there are spaces now that never used to be before with policymakers, right? And so I think it's important to bear in mind that, this relationship is not sort of fixed in time. The way we see each other, yes, I mean, history is a bit hard to erase, but surely COVID has allowed us an opportunity, to Shona's point, I'm going to bring up COVID, has really given us this opportunity to toss, things up a little bit, and perhaps both need to sort of, entertain the possibility of a new lens to look at the other, right? And I think that's certainly an opportunity to look at, but I'm not saying that this good activist, bad activist thing, it's completely wiped out. It's not. I've been very much pushing for all the major groups to be actually sitting in the task force, and I'll make it, public. And I think that's important, not so much for my alignment to any specific group, but I think to Mohan's point is that at the larger ecosystem, in terms of sort of the change that we're trying to make, I still go back to that at the systems level. If we want to actually have some, structural change that's sustainable, we need to actually all come together and not have some folks having more information than others. So that's my take on this.
Thank you, Anthea, and also thank you, Jeremy, from the floor. I'm just very struck by how I think, and I'll get to Mohan, I'll get to you in a second. I'm just very struck by how we've been moving through all these binaries, like researcher, advocate, in front, behind, and good and bad, and really thinking about how to build bridges across all of them, which I think is extremely important. So, Mohan, over to you.
I want to begin by saying, Jeremy, that I so appreciate the work that HealthServe does. And I think that you do really important work that is so vital. And in fact, I'm grateful for a lot of early work of care being connected to HealthServe in that sense, and learned a lot from that. I really believe in the idea that may 1,000 flowers bloom, that there are different registers, different ways, and different processes of seeking change. So absolutely those negotiations and evidence-based dialogues that need to be had with ministries, they form one particular register for change. And all I'm saying is that in addition to that, perhaps we can also think about making space for other registers for change. And, going back to what Anthea is saying is that perhaps COVID is a new way to imagine the world. And, for those of you that read Arundhati Roy, she wrote this beautiful piece, The Pandemic is a Portal. And if you truly think about it as a portal, and one of the ways to consider that is that maybe we are also moving toward a space where there can be more public disagreements, and disagreements can be seen as meaningful ways for building solutions and changing structures. I mean, this is a great example. In this panel, we are disagreeing in a public way and co-constructing in that process. So perhaps those in power also have a moment of pedagogy in that sense. And from what Anthea is saying, it seems like those changes are also taking place in some registers, and that's key. And the only point I will come back to then is the idea of valuing those that push for structural transformation. Because I think, sometimes what happens is in a pragmatic context, we too often learn to portray those that raise questions of structural transformations as troublemakers. And I remember very clearly, and I'm sure each of you have had these kinds of experiences, where there are instances where I was told, why am I associating with publicly this particular activist, as if I would become tarnished through that association. And I think that that kind of framing can be quite problematic discursively. So I'm hoping that this post-COVID moment is also a moment for us to truly be humble about respecting those that push for change and push for structural transformation and question dominant power configurations. So hopefully in that process, we will have more dialogic spaces that will work both incrementally on solutions based on evidence, and at the same time, we'll have spaces for critiquing that model and asking for more structural transformations. And in all of that, I'm hoping that we will have spaces where migrant workers will participate and will be able to collectivize and organize and raise their voices. One of the beautiful things I noticed during the pandemic, because I was doing some digital ethnographic work on forums that are run by migrant workers, particularly Bangladeshi migrant workers in Bangla. And one of the things that was so amazing is the dialogue. Not everyone agreed. Like some workers felt that the state was doing a good job. It was taking care of them and doing its best. And there were these various groups that were doing really good work. There are others that felt that the systemic problem continued, the food quality continued to be poor. And that's great because, again, there was that debate and those different viewpoints being articulated. Thanks, Shona.
Thank you so much.
Can I just chime in very quickly here that I agree with Mohan fully, and that's something that I think that our government has not been very good at. That I don't believe that there are activists who want to do Singapore harm. I think that we're all patriots, and the more you care, the more you speak out, and the more people suffer and sacrifice for their beliefs. I personally would regard them as being much more fervent lovers of Singapore and the Singapore way, and that's why people hang around to really drive the change. It's frankly much less patriotic to keep quiet and accept the status quo. Back to you, Shona.
Absolutely, Jeremy. Thank you so much for that powerful reminder. Yeah, that criticism is not unpatriotic, that's a sign of love. And Mohan, thank you so much. I think, again, it's so interesting that I think this idea that difference is not the same as a threat, it applies to how we view migrant workers, but also how we view each other, right, as a society. And it's important to think about what society could emerge if we view disagreement differently. And also thank you for reminding us that there's a difference between accepting that binaries exist in the minds of some people, but that as an individual, you can recognize that and yet choose to communicate otherwise, and to say, I don't accept this. Thank you. I also just want to read a comment that we got that I think relates to this. And one of the commenters says, community-based participatory research is a great approach to take. to center the voices of migrant workers, which requires collective, reflective, and systematic inquiry where the community, in this case migrant workers, and researchers work together as equal partners or have the community drive the research focus. And I think that this idea of community and who is community is something we keep returning to. So I have a question now from a commenter directly to Anthea, who said, and this person says, thank you for making the point that we should always ensure that our migrant friends are imagining, organizing, and participating directly in any solutions and vision on their behalf. Do you think that sometimes Singaporean changemakers or volunteers overshadow the voices of migrants they are supporting? And how can Singaporeans in this space contribute without eroding migrants' agency?
It's a great question. I think the simple answer to whether I think sometimes Singaporean changemakers, volunteers overshadow the voices of our migrant friends, certainly, and not intentionally. I think that's for sure. But by legacy of the way we have been conditioned, right, to support our migrant friends. Often it is in the form of sort of, giving food or volunteering, at different levels. And maybe that sort of narrative that they are less and therefore, or they have less, and therefore we must come forward to help, right? And to give and to provide. So that narrative, I think it's not, it's not a sinister one, clearly, but it clearly would drown out the voices of our migrant friends. Not to mention that clearly strip, away their dignity and their agency. So I would still say, I mean, I'm not saying that it's so clear cut. I mean, there are clearly going to be migrant friends in the hundreds of thousands of them in our midst who may be in a position where we do need to come in to provide, right? Because, they may not have the resources they need to get by or to do what they need to do. But there are so many, and I think, between us here in this room, we know there's so many that have got, their own inner resources at so many levels that if we actually listen to them, if we invite them into our space, and then also giving them permission to invite us into their space, then so much magic can happen that would help us to imagine new possibilities, whether it's in terms of solutions or in moving the relationship between Singaporeans and our migrant friends forward in a more meaningful way, and certainly to go into a more sort of equal and just type of a level, right, in terms of our relationship. So yeah, there's still a lot of it on, but like I said, we know they don't come from a bad place, so we just have to keep raising awareness on that. This whole concept that Mohan has been sharing about solidarity. Personally, I think for me, it's not just migrant workers. The work of a good space is also to bring back that inner agency, right, to the vulnerable communities, as we call them, in our midst, so that they actually have a voice and they can step forward and be part of this change that we are looking at for the society.
Thank you so much for reminding us that. I think we talk a lot about voice, but it is a complicated question. Yeah, and I think, as you said, firstly, it demands a lot of reflection on what has gone right and what's gone wrong. And secondly, that it's also an evolving process and a learning process for everyone. If you don't get it right the first time or really any time. Okay, Jeremy, did you have something to say? Please go for it.
A quick comment that well, we paternalistic doctors tend to behave a lot like the government, saying and assuming we know best. And in this era where the voice of the patient is becoming so important and so relevant, I'm very struck by this comment that is a common refrain amongst patient groups: nothing for me, nothing to me without me. And I think that's a useful mental model for us to bear in mind. Back to you, Shona.
Nothing to me, for me. Say that again. I want to remember it.
Nothing to me, nothing for me, without me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I think, yeah, it's wonderful to see this kind of revolution in thinking about relating to people, not just in terms of migrant workers, but in terms of so many other groups and across so many professions. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our session, but I just want to ask our panelists if you have any closing comments, anything you want to pick up on at all, just a few sentences. So maybe we'll start with our original order. So Mohan first.
Thank you so much for this beautiful panel. And I just want to thank both Jeremy and Anthea and you, Shona. It's been so great. I just want to come back to the idea of solidarity and just say with humility that I see solidarity as a way for us to commit to relationships. In this case, commit to relationships with migrant workers by being willing to place our bodies and our privilege on the line. So I will, just leave you with a short quote from a recessional hymn, I learned as a child and it still sticks with me. And it goes like this. It says, it takes courage to answer a call. It takes courage to give your all, to go at stake for another one's sake. It takes courage to be true. Thanks, Shona.
Thank you, Mohan. That was beautiful and a wonderful highlight of, I guess, the humanity in all of us, be it researchers or however else you're positioned in society. All right, Jeremy?
Let me take us back to HealthServe's vision, which interestingly has nothing to do with health. And our own vision statement is, we believe in a society where every migrant worker lives a life of dignity. And that represents solidarity to me, where everyone, we could substitute migrant worker with special needs child and so on and so forth, but everyone deserves and to live a life of dignity. HealthServe's chosen route to this is through healthcare services, and we fully recognize that this is only one of the aspects that really disadvantaged and vulnerable populations need. And the work that our peers in the NGO sector do in other facets are equally legitimate, and we really work together towards this endpoint of lives of dignity. Back to you, Shona. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. What a powerful reminder. And yeah, I think just the idea of dignity and your chosen route to it, depending on where you're best placed, is so wonderful. All right. And finally, Anthea.
Thank you, Shona. I'll echo Mohan's sentiments. This has been such a great way to spend my Friday evening. Mohan, I'm so impressed that you are still looking so cheery at this time of the night for you. But such a pleasure. It's been such an honor and such a humbling experience to be sharing the panel with you, and just to sort of just wrap it all up, given what Jeremy started with that quote, and also Mohan's short verse. I would end my sharing with borrowing from the Ubuntu words, right, from Africa, and I would say that I am because we are. And I think this really sums up what we are all really trying to say here, that our migrant friends are really part of us, and we are because of them, and they are because of us.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful and uplifting way to end the panel, which in my experience is not how research panels normally end. So thank you all so much for all your thoughts, your insights, and you sharing your experiences. This has, as you say, Anthea, a wonderful way to spend a Friday evening. And thank you so much to everyone who's asked a question, who's joined in tonight. And I hope this leaves us with something to think about for a long time to come. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And good night, Mohan.
Good night.
Good night, Mohan.